Hi guys, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center. The Nehru Center is the cultural wing of the Indian High Commission in the UK, and we've been in existence for many decades, and we organize wonderful events at this very auditorium. You can register for our newsletter at our website nehrucenter.org.uk. You don't need to write them down, they will be displayed at the bottom of the screen. You can also come to our Facebook page, which is a verified page, the Nehru Center. You can follow updates on all our events on Twitter as well, the Nehru Center, that's also a verified account. Or you can come to our YouTube channel, again, the Nehru Center. We are nothing if not consistent. I hope you do come to our online channels and enjoy the events that we're putting up for you. Thanks so much for all your love and support. Namaste, Jai Hind.
Namaste. My name is Amish Tripathi, and I am the director of the Nehru Center. And we are truly honored to be presenting this program today. We have Ambassador Pavan Varma with us to launch his latest book, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, The Great Hindu Civilization. In fact, I had told Ambassador Varma a few days back that I think this is his best book yet. And I have to update my opinion now. Honestly, I think this is one of the best books I have ever read. If we can call Ambassador Varma up on stage, please.
Hello, Amish.
Varma,
How are you?
how are you, sir?
Very well. Thank you. And I'm honored to be with you.
Thank you so much. And it's in a way calling you back home, Ambassador Varma. If I may do the formalities, if I could read out the formal introduction of yours before we begin the program. Uh, Ambassador Pavan Varma is a writer, diplomat, and now in politics, where he was till recently an MP in the Rajya Sabha. He's the author of over a dozen best-selling books and has been an Indian ambassador in several countries, including Bhutan. He was also the official spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs. He was also the Director General of ICCR, Press Secretary to the President of India, and most importantly, he was the director of the Nehru Center right here in London. He was my predecessor many years ago. Sir, welcome back to your office. Ambassador Varma was conferred an honorary doctoral degree for his contribution to the fields of diplomacy, literature, culture, and aesthetics by the University of Indianapolis in 2005. And 2012, Ambassador Varma was conferred Bhutan's highest civilian award, the Druk Thukse, by His Majesty, the King of Bhutan. He was also awarded the Kalinga International Literary Award in 2019. Ambassador Varma, you are, of course, a senior of mine in the field of diplomacy, in the field of working for India's heritage and culture abroad. But I genuinely believe you are a senior of mine in the field of writing as well as scholar who has put together a book, the breadth of which truly inspires me. And we're going to discuss this book in a lot of detail. But Pavanji, before we begin, we don't have the pleasure of a physical launch anymore. We can't rip apart the wrapping paper. So we put together an online launch of your book. If we can play that video, and then we'll begin the conversation. If you can play that video, please.
Thank you. That was very professionally done.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Verma. Um, one of my regrets for this event is that there is only an hour, and I have so many questions from this book because the breadth and depth in which you've covered what is, in my opinion, a very, very important subject, one that has been ignored to a very large extent. I'll try my best to cover as many of the questions as I can. Master Varma, I also received a lot of questions from Nehru Center viewers, so I will try and get to that too. And of course, I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions coming up out here as well. With your permission, if we can just jump in straight away.
Certainly.
Um, right at the beginning, you jump into what can be a contentious issue straight away, where there is a large school of thought which has been a dominant school of thought in India and in the colonial parts of the West, of denial of India as a nation and of Hinduism at its ancient core. You address this quite directly, but in I would think a rather calm manner as well. If you could take us through that argument of those who would say that Hinduism is India was not that ancient a nation. The British created us, and secondly, even if it was, Hinduism is not at its core.
Well, first I want to eschew all chauvinism and xenophobia. I would like to base my arguments to the best of my ability on objective fact, legitimate inferencing. And I think if that is a count, if that is the yardstick, I think that Hindu civilization has all the attributes by which you can call it not only a civilization but a great civilization. There are people who mistake the use of the word nation
Hmm.
with civilization. A nation is a more recent entity in the form that we know it politically. In fact, it was after the Treaty of Westphalia that you had
Yes.
nation states being born
Yeah.
with
And
defined
which was only in the
geographical,
17th century.
which is only the 17th century, with defined geographical boundaries uh, uh, delineated on a map as my territory or your territory. It was predated and post-dated by what is known as a civilizational entity. I think India has always been a civilizational entity going back to the dawn of time and marked by great antiquity, continuity, peaks of refinement, assimilation, and diversity. There are now many people who interrogate, doubt, question, and even deny this influence. There are several arguments, Amish, that they put forward to, which I have dealt with in my book in the very first chapter, where I talk about Hindu civilization, myth or reality. Very quickly, as a recap, the first argument is that there is no such word as Hindu, which I believe is not valid because you have Megasthenes in the
Hmm.
4th century BCE referring to the Hindus, you have the Persians, the Arab, the Chinese, all of whom refer
Hmm.
to a definitive set of people who have evolved in the same geographical crucible for millennia. And so there is, I don't believe, merit in saying that there is no such word as Hindu.
Hmm.
Then the next argument is that there is no such word, there is no civilization that can be associated with Hindu. And I question those premises. Uh, in fact, there are scholars like Dr. Sanjay Subramaniam who say that essentially Indian history is the crossroads of history, a succession of empires rather than a definitive civilization, which I believe is not a valid conclusion to draw upon. The third argument is that even if there was a civilization, why can't we call it Buddhist? And my argument is that Buddhism, although a great religion,
Hmm.
was a offshoot, a protest movement from within Hinduism,
Hmm.
and there was never such an adversarial nature between Buddhism and Hinduism, or for that matter, Jainism and Hinduism. Jainism, another great religion, and that the underlying template of this entire period was Hindu, but there could have been great religions that emerged from it, like Buddhism and Jainism. So, to call this period a Buddhist civilization rather than a Hindu one is a fallacy. Then there is the question that is raised that if there is something called a Hindu civilization, is there something which is a unified Hinduism? Is there, can we, as Wendy Doniger says,
Hmm.
write Hinduism with a capital H?
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and she even goes on to say that to her mind it is a cross between a hedgehog and a tortoise, something which has left me quite flummoxed. Uh,
Pavanji, if I may just add one thing to your question, and for the benefit of those who may not have had the pleasure of reading the book as yet, if you could answer this a bit more on Wendy Doniger as well. Uh, she sees the absence of dogma in Hinduism as a reason to say that it doesn't exist, which flummoxes me. That a fact that a religion is not dogmatic, is open to questioning, is not otherizing someone else, she sees as something bad, and therefore
yeah,
the
I
religion
think,
doesn't exist. It was kind of bizarre.
yeah, it is bizarre because I think she is overly influenced by the certitudes of Abrahamic faiths,
Hmm.
and she finds that this diversity within Hinduism, which it consciously nurtures,
Hmm.
it is the conquering eclecticism of Hinduism and the diversity and verisimilitude that it nurtures without losing sight of its central unifying narrative.
Hmm.
She finds that diversity uh, almost perplexing, and therefore she believes that there is not one Hinduism but several Hinduisms,
Hmm.
uh, which I believe is again not a valid reference inference to draw. Then there are those who wish to see this entire civilizational debate only through the focus of economics. The Marxist historians who would rather see class than civilization, and I believe, and many historians of great expertise and objectivity say that this is a very narrow prism by which to take a holistic view of a civilization. And finally, there are those who say that, uh, who feel that you cannot interrogate the antiquity of this civilization. If otherwise you go back to reliable scientific data, which is verifiable, which consists of hydrology, geology, textual material, uh, you know, soil testing, and so on and so forth, including remote sensing data, which predates this civilization primarily along the discourse of the river Saraswati, uh, then they believe that uh, any such attempt is an attempt to over glorify the Hindu period, and so it needs to be downplayed. So, for all these reasons, there are arguments which question the existence of Hindu civilization and devalue its antiquity. And there is a reason why many of them, powerful votaries of this opinion, like Dr. Amartya Sen, make this argument. And if you like, I could expound on it now or later.
I would like to come to that, Pavanji, because you do speak on the arguments of Amartya Sen, Dr. Amartya Sen. You do speak on the Indus Saraswati civilization on the works of Michel Denino. Before we come to that, Pavanji, I think one of the things where this debate gets lost, perhaps, is the vitiated manner of this debate between Marxists and right wing extremists. If you want to call that, I don't know if the Western left and right can be applied to India, but in any case, uh, you are certainly, and we'll obviously not get into the politics of it, but you are certainly not someone who can be called right wing, whatever it means, in India. You don't subscribe to that politically.
What I can tell you, Amish, is that I'm being criticized by both the left and the right. So I think I must be doing something right.
My question, Pavanji, is calm, reasoned debate getting lost on this very, very important civilizational issue because of modern political battles, which are often a reflection of the West, actually. It has nothing to do with Indian realities.
Well, I don't know if it has nothing to do with Indian
But,
realities.
sorry,
I think,
I say from Marxism's
yeah,
perspective, not.
as far as Marxism is concerned, let's call a spade a spade. Karl Marx knew nothing about India or Hindu civilization or Indian civilization. He admits it almost. He comes out with certain generalized surmises,
Uh,
which frankly even Marxist historians devalue today.
uh,
His theory of imperial despotism and as the only hallmark of Indian history.
uh,
Uh, and the Marxist uh, proclivity to immediately do whether it's serfdom or feudalism, and to go into those details. I'm not saying it's not something that enriches history.
hmm,
There is an economic perspective to history, but it's not the entire window.
true,
It's a very narrow part of the window of judging civilization.
true.
So, but there is a very strong Indian context to this debate. And that is what I want to allude to, and that is why I referred to Dr. Amartya Sen.
Fair.
You see, people like Dr. Amartya Sen, I only say this because I have great respect otherwise for him as a scholar. Dr. Amartya Sen and those of his ilk believe that any attempt to acknowledge the legitimate and verifiable refinements of ancient India, including its antiquity
Hmm,
or greater antiquity, will ultimately reinforce the ultra right Hindutva rhetoric today. Now,
hmm,
this is a peculiarly Indian context
hmm,
to a civilizational debate.
hmm,
So, therefore, they believe that if they devalue, demean, denigrate, or underplay these achievements of the past,
hmm,
then they are in some way helping to preserve secularism today because otherwise they feel that the spokespersons of the ultra Hindu right narrative will run away
hmm,
with the thesis of the over glorification of Hinduism to the marginalization
hmm,
of other faiths that make up the Republic of India and lead ultimately to Hindu dominance.
hmm,
So, now, in my view, there are two separate issues.
hmm,
One is that you can take a position against all religious extremisms, including that of the Hindu ultra right. And that is a valid position.
hmm,
And even I have great reservations about some of its bigotry, exclusion, and violence. That needs to be battled today in our context. That is not to be battled by devaluing the legitimate achievements of the past.
hmm,
So when Dr. Amartya Sen, for instance, dismisses out of hand the
hmm,
latest scientific evidence, as you rightly said, put forward by Danino and others,
hmm,
on the greater antiquity of Hindu civilization, which predates it by at least a millennium.
Hmm.
He says explicitly that he is doing it because he does not want the present day narrative to over glorify Hinduism,
Hmm.
and which is, I believe, mixing apples and oranges. They're two separate issues. So I have a
Minimization of
problem with that.
scholarship. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a problem. I mean, Dr. Amartya Sen, in order to do this, will go, with great respect to him, to certain ridiculous extremes like arguing that Panini was not a Hindu scholar. He was an Afghan because he was born along the banks of the Kabul River, forgetting that at that time that part of Afghanistan was under the Mauryan Empire.
Right.
So, I mean, you cannot caricature an argument beyond a point in order to reinforce your present predilection. That's my point.
Which is a fair. I guess you're trying to walk that hard middle, Pavanji. Uh, but it is a hard path, but it must be walked. If we can expand a bit for the benefit of our viewers, Pavanji, uh, the uh, the arguments you put in on uh, the dating of the Vedas, and that it was probably 1,000, probably much more older when it was actually put down orally. It may have been even older, based on the works of Michel Danino and others, and modern hydrological and other data that is coming up um upon the Saraswati River, where Dholavira, other Indus Saraswati civilization sites are being discovered, and what that does to our conception of the Vedas and the dating of the Vedas.
Well, it's a long argument which can have a brief recap.
Right.
Essentially, the colonial theory was that there was an Aryan invasion around the 1500 CE or BC, and it overran the existing Indus Valley civilization. And so the Vedas, the Rig Veda being the first Veda, is also dated to around 1500 BCE. Uh, Actually, now new evidence shows that, for instance, the Rig Veda mentions the Saraswati River 72 times. There are 44 occasions when it refers to it as, uh, you know, this mighty tempestuous river flowing from the Himalayas to the ocean. There are three separate hymns in the Rig Veda on merely a tribute to the great river Saraswati.
Hmm.
So Denino makes this point, and other scholars now tend to agree, that if the Rigveda is talking about the Saraswati not once but repeatedly and reiterating its assessment of being a great river flowing from the Himalayas to the ocean, there must have been a river. Now, if there was a river, what do we know about it? What we know is that sometime in the third millennium BCE, that river began to dry up due to a variety of possible reasons. One of the most popular ones, that there were tectonic shifts by which the waters of the Saraswati joined some other great rivers like the Jhelum and the Indus, and so on and so forth. So it began to dry up, and ultimately, as you know, it now occupies the Paleo Valley of the Ghagra River, which is almost a dried up river. So, if the Rigvedic Aryans were speaking about a mighty and tempestuous river, and doing so with great elegance and elaboration, they must have been doing so of a river that actually was a mighty and tempestuous river, unless they had very fertile imaginations and imagined a particular river Saraswati in that form.
Uh,
Therefore, they must have been writing before the Saraswati began to dry up, which happened only in the third millennium BCE, as all the scientific data now points out. Therefore, you are able to predate the Vedic civilization by at least, if not more, a millennium. And one of the other conclusions is that the Indus Valley civilization and the Rigvedic civilization were not necessarily adversarial, but that there were great valley overlaps. In fact, many remnants of the Indus Valley civilization have been found along the banks of that same river Saraswati, and that therefore a composite Hindu civilization, for the lack of any other better word, or an Indus civilization, which was Indu or Indus, evolved many centuries prior to the conventional colonial belief of its dating.
If we go a bit further on this, Pawanji, because you allude to a few other debates as well, Professor Upendra Singh, a scholarly historian, the daughter of former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, speaks of there not being enough archaeological evidence for an invasion by the Aryans. Uh, Even Professor Ramila Thapar says that it was perhaps a migration rather than an invasion. What are your thoughts on that? How that impacts your view of
No, in fact,
civilization?
Dr. Upinder Singh says that the universally most rejected theory is that of an Aryan invasion. There
Hmm.
is literally no evidence of it.
Hmm.
So, if there was not an invasion, there must have been over a period of time, over centuries perhaps, a migration of people who called themselves or whom we call now the Aryans,
Hmm.
possibly. And while all of this is shrouded in the remote uh, uh, passages of history, it seems pretty clear that there was no invasion, but that there were a series of migrations which ultimately led to a composite people called the Hindus, evolving from almost being qualifying to be one of the oldest civilizations of the world.
If there's before I move on to the age of the civilization, one of the fascinating things you speak of is the continuities from the Indus civilization or the Indus Saraswati civilization, whatever we call it, to modern India. And I recall something which I remember I'd read Kalidasa's play Malavikagni Mitram. I don't know if you've read that, Pavanji, and in that there's a description of a dancer standing in almost the exact same pose as the dancing girl found in the Indus civilization. You speak of the armband of the priest king and modern Indians wearing, still the Orthodox ones, still wearing armbands. How do you see those continuities which last
You know, there are
years?
there's a lot of evidence now on the overlapping between the Indus Valley and the Rigvedic civilization, which prove the point that they were not two water compartmentalized, separate, parallelly evolving civilizations, but actually a composite civilization with a great deal of interface and interaction with each other. And this can be gauged from, I mean, I'm giving you top of the evidence. There is much more. The prototype Shiva that is found in the Indus Valley civilization, the
The
dancing,
Pashupati scene.
the Pashupati scene. It can be found from the worship of the mother goddess.
Hmm.
As you know, Hinduism is perhaps the only religion that gives so much veneration to the Devi.
Hmm. The mother god.
It must have origins somewhere, and the way the wells were made, the dimensions of the walled city, and so on and so forth. There are so many overlaps. Even the way The system of weights and measures of the Indus Valley is identical to the weights and measures described in the Arthashastra by Kautilya
The
centuries
modern.
later.
Yeah.
So I can give you many more examples, but suffice to say that uh, there were great overlaps and there was an interface between the two.
Fascinating. There's one question I had, which occurred to me where, I had some doubts or questions. You speak of ancient India surviving, which, one of the few pre-Bronze Age cultures that has survived to this day. I agree. You say Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, ancient cultures did not survive. Again, I agree. But you say China is not a living ancient tradition. I thought it was. I was wondering what I. It's one of the other cultures that has survived to this day. On what basis is that? Uh,
No,
how did you come to that view?
I think that the Chinese have gone through uh, many uh, ruptures with the past. Uh, I don't mean that of military invasion,
Hmm.
but in the field of uh, psychological ruptures. Uh, I don't think the Chinese civilization has the continuity to the modern time
Hmm.
of the Hindu civilization. That's the only point that I wish to make. But
Hmm.
the important point I made was that most of the ancient great civilizations in time became museum relics
Yes.
or antiquity, whereas the Hindu civilization uh, never became confined to a museum. It went through its own vicissitudes and ups and downs, but it has survived today with much of the past still intact, alas, not as many of its wisdoms, and certainly, unfortunately, some of its blemishes.
Which brings me to actually what I thought was the most fascinating part of the book. We will go to the other parts as well. Of why did ancient India survive? This fascinating chapter you have of the audacity of thought. Why do you think ancient India survived?
You see, because it was a very cerebral civilization, the level of ideation was very strong.
Hmm.
There was application of mind, and the mind is far more indestructible than matter. You cannot normally kill a butterfly with a sword.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, what could not be destroyed became Sanatan because came from the recesses of the mind. And I say this in the audacity of thought. I mean, look at the amazing concept of the Upanishads. They are a dialogue not about God.
Hmm.
It requires remarkable cerebral courage
Hmm.
at a time when conventional divinity was the only thing most people were looking for,
Hmm.
to be actually wrestling with what could be the ultimate truth.
Hmm.
Similarly, the six systems of Hindu philosophy,
Hmm.
the Nyaya, the Vaisheshik, the Sankhya, the Yoga, the Purva Mimansh, the Uttar Mimansh, they are not dealing with God. In fact, they can technically be called atheists.
Hmm.
They are again searching for that ultimate truth behind the bewildering plurality of this cosmos. Uh, the nature of Hinduism is such that it is dialogic. So there are no brittle fiats or absolutes. Nobody has been burnt for heresy on the stake in Hinduism.
Hmm.
You know, the Upanishads are a dialogue, the Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue, the Brahma Sutras make it a point to include in the commentary the point of view of the opponent.
Mm.
Uh, and these are the three foundational texts of
Right.
Hinduism. So it's dialogue. I
Mm.
mean, I need hardly point out to your viewers and to you the great debate between Adi Shankaracharya
Yes.
and Mandan Mishra, where they came from very opposed points of view, even hostile points of view, between Gyan Marg and the Marg of Karma Kand. And yet they did not chop off each other's heads. They sat down to have a civilized discourse, Shastra.
Mm.
And this applies across the board to many other institutions within Hindu civilization. For instance, the four Purushasthas, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Quite remarkable in the almost Confucian balance and the courage they display. We had a discussion on this the other day, where they refused to reduce Dharma or a code of conduct to 10 commands,
Mm.
but had the courage to say that while there is an ethical code to society, the ultimate label of what is absolutely right or wrong depends on context, situation, circumstance, etc. It requires a lot of courage.
True.
Similarly, the four ashrams,
Mm.
uh, and similarly, the great balance between the nirguna,
And the second.
Brahm, and the Sagun Ishwar. It's a remarkable concept. How do you destroy a civilization which is willing to worship an ordinary piece of stone as a manifestation of that attributeless Brahm?
Mm.
Akhand, Adrisht, Achintya, Nirvishesh, Matram, Sarva Pratyay, Darshanin, undifferentiated consciousness, and Purna, complete, total, Nirguna, attributeless. At one level, that can be manifested in anything. You can convert a tree into a god as a manifestation of that, which flummoxes foreign observers often the number of deities. It is because essentially the truth is anchored in an enduring belief in the oneness of all creation, of an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, all pervasive cosmic force, which has a representation where the human imagination revels in the many forms of its expression. It is the freedom to do so, anchored in that one notion of that cosmic unity. So it's a very cerebral civil. I mean, take the theory of rasa.
Right.
I mean, 600 years before the birth of Christ, you had a book written called the Natya Shastra by Bharat,
Mm.
which is not a compendium of the arts. It is a meditation on what constitutes the aesthetic experience.
Mm.
If you want an example of sheer celebration, it is this.
Mm.
So, therefore, the normal stunting brittleness of civilizations was conspicuously absent in the ideation of Hinduism, which is why it could not be killed easily.
And I found the point that you made fascinating deep of a civilization which did deep ideation and then was able to convert that deep ideation into rituals and practices that could be understood by all, and then even more was able to get millions of people across the entire subcontinent aware of that and practice that. uh, you're right, it is such a remarkable thing, which is why I guess it was so difficult to kill off. There wasn't one head to cut off, it had spread everywhere. And an idea is difficult to kill when it is spread everywhere. Pavanji, I continue to have a few more questions, but there are people asking questions as well. There was one question on Buddhism. If we can put that up, I found that fascinating because many of the Westerners, their introduction to yoga, dharma, is usually through Buddhism. So Valerie Dalton asks, I haven't heard it said before that Buddhism came from Hinduism. Is this, excuse me, generally believed to be so? Valley Dalton, director of the Live Literature Company.
Well,
Pavanji.
generally, there is so much overlap between Hinduism and Buddhism that, as an illustrative point, let me say that the great reviver of Hinduism in the 8th century CE, the great Adi Shankaracharya, is accused by his critics of being, within Hinduism, his critics to be, he's accused of being a klepto Buddhist. And that indeed is true. It's a dharmic, it's a dharmic offshoot of a dharmic religion,
Hmm.
uh, with the same level of ideation and the absence of absolute fiats.
Hmm.
fiats. Uh, but Buddhism came out as a protest movement against the Brahmanical hegemony and the ritualisms of Hinduism, and rightly so. And rightly so. And there is much that is common between them, and so it is certainly considered an offshoot of Hinduism, and for that very reason, the majority of royal patronage received or bestowed upon both these religions was by kings who were either Hindu or Buddhist, who patronized both and never saw them as entirely distinct.
Hmm. Yeah. There was no concept that this is an opposing religion, so we have to oppress them. As you said rightly, I mean there were Hindu Gupta kings who supported viharas, and various Buddhist Pala kings who supported Hindu temples. Uh, Mohit Kumar Sanu is asking, is Sanatan Dharma the mother of all religions? I don't know if this uh, Abrahamic religions are different, Mohit. But Pavanji, if you want to ask this, then I can come back to a few other questions that I have.
I don't think we should look for the mother of all religions,
Yeah.
but we should see what is the most enduring and animating thought process which guides spirituality.
Hmm. Fair. Uh, Pavanji, you speak of the Islamic conquest, which began around, uh, and there were invasions in the 11th century, but truly began around the 12th century. Uh, the conquerors really came in deep. Uh, and you speak of the impact of that. And but before I ask you to expand on the impact of that on Hindu civilization, can I run a theory to you? There are those who say that if we don't call the British colonial rule the Christian rule, is it fair to call the Turkic colonial rule the Islamic rule? Because the rulers were all Turkic, they weren't Indian Muslims. And a vast majority of the Muslims in India today are not Ashraf. Ashraf claim descent from the Turks or Arabs, who are not more than 5-10% of Muslims. In fact, most of the Ashrafs went to Pakistan with the partition. So, is it fair to call it Islamic when the vast proportion of Muslims in India who are Pasmanda Muslims, who are descendants of Hindus or Buddhists, are not descendants of the foreigners who invaded us? So there is that thought that should it actually be called the Turkic colonial rule, not Islamic rule. What's your view on that first, and then of course on the impact of that conquest on
No,
Hindu
I
civilization?
think that it's a rubric of relative convenience to dub that period as one of Islamic rule.
Hmm.
The original invaders were Turkic, uh, and it led to 600 years roughly of
Hmm.
Islamic rule, with exceptions in certain parts of India.
Hmm.
But of Islamic rule, one reason also why that appellation holds
Hmm.
is that the new invaders were deeply motivated and driven by religion,
Hmm.
of which I have no doubt whatsoever.
Hmm.
There was religious fanaticism, there was a sharp distinction they drew between believers and infidels. There was a strong line etched in stone between Darul Harb and Darul Islam. So it was a deeply proselytizing, religiously motivated invasion, which got diluted in certain phases of that history or strengthened,
mm,
but is one of the recognizing features of what began as the Turkic invasion.
fair, fair. But
Well,
in terms of the impact of that on Hindu civilization, you wanna?
I have said in my book that it was an exceptionally traumatic impact for Hinduism.
Mm,
They had seen the Bactrians, the Scythians, the Greeks invasion, but had probably not encountered invaders who were so deeply driven, as I just made the point, by religious fanaticism. And this sustained loot and plunder and destruction, driven also by religious belief, was of a scale which was unprecedented for Hindus.
mm,
And so I make that point. It's not only me. Bill Durant has said that it constitutes one of the darkest periods of history, the Islamic invasion. Uh, and there was, therefore, a great deal of plunder and destruction in its wake. Now, the impact was that Hinduism received, the normal evolution of Hinduism received a great setback.
mm,
Uh, Temples were destroyed, centers of learning were destroyed. The normal tempo of continuation, celebration, interaction within Hinduism received a serious setback. Uh, and I think Hinduism managed to survive it because it was able to reinvent and transform itself. And that is primarily, but not only, through the great bhakti movement, which I think is one of the greatest devotional movements in the history of religion and spirituality. It was pan Indian in scope. It led to an efflorescence of remarkable poetry never seen before in the subcontinent in the language of the masses, unlike in Sanskrit. It railed against caste hierarchies. It opposed Brahmanical hegemony. It made Hinduism bottom up instead of top down. It took it to the masses so that it was far more difficult to destroy it. It simplified its ritualisms to chanting and kirtan and so on and so forth. So, on the whole, whether it was Tukaram in Maharashtra or Chandidas or Vidyapati or Surdas or the Andal or Mirabai or the Nayanars or the Alvars or Allama Prabhu or Basavanna, I mean Chaitanya or Vallabh, I mean it was the most remarkable uh, movement which allowed Hinduism to reinvent in order as a consequence or following the impact of the Turkic invasion.
fair, fair, very fair point. There was one more question out here before I come to the next question. This is from Neelam Singh. Pavanji, is the Hindu civilization going through a downtime in the present day, particularly in India? What would you say to that?
I think so. I don't believe it is being weak. It is becoming weaker, but I believe it is in danger of being seeing distortion. And I have devoted several pages to this in my final chapter of the book. Uh, First of all, there are three reasons why I say this. First of all, I am always a little perplexed about the lack of curiosity bordering on indifference among Hindus themselves about their religion, spirituality, metaphysics, and civilization. and ignorance makes any entity weaker.
mm,
So I think Hinduism once again needs for its own followers to rediscover and rediscover their great heritage.
mm,
Secondly, I believe Hinduism is not strongly enough embracing the reforms it needs, including in this area of ending caste discrimination, oppression, exploitation, and inequality.
mm,
All are great leaders, from Jyotibai Phule to Swami Vivekanand to Dr. Ambedkar to, of course, Mahatma Gandhi to Sri Aurobindo. They have all emphasized on the importance of internal reform within Hinduism on two fundamental issues:
mm,
caste discriminations and gender disparity.
mm.
Hinduism needs to reform itself in order to become stronger and definitely more congruent with modern priorities. And even if it wants itself to be called fully civilized, unless if it unless it reforms itself, it will be falling short. The third distortion comes from the lumpen ultra right of Hinduism, which, in my view, have become the new thekedars, the thugs. You know, what is thekedars in English? I don't know, but anyway, people understand it. The new monopolists of Hinduism. Now, these people, unfortunately, are marked by several features. One is very little knowledge about Hinduism itself.
Perhaps the correct term would be inquisitors,
Inquisitive.
which the
Well,
concept itself is actually foreign to Hinduism. It
yeah,
comes more from the
yeah,
Abrahamic side. But yeah,
I
yeah.
think it needs a better writer than I am to get the right word for it. In you, I have got it. Now, they have very little knowledge about Hinduism. In fact, their evangelism and activism is in inverse proportion to their knowledge. Secondly, they are averse to dialogue, and that too is because they are insecure due to their lack of knowledge. They are ultra conservative, usually orthodox beyond sustainability, patriarchal, uh, prone to violence, and prone also to taking the law into their own hands. And they are forever legislating to Hindus, which is in and Hinduism is not a prescriptive faith, how to behave, how to eat, what to wear, what how to speak, what to eat, and especially where women are concerned, they are intolerably patriarchal and chauvinist and sexist, where they seem to dictate how women should behave and what they should wear and you know uh, uh, and how they should dress, which is in terms of their antiquated notions of what a chaste Hindu woman is all about, and so on and so forth. I'm giving you a random example. Now,
But in
this
ancient Hinduism, I mean, women have high measure of respect. Actually, in fact,
actually, yes, I
actually
argue that
scriptures
point
say the gods abandon the land where women are not respected.
exactly, and there are many aspects to this. But let me first answer the first question, then I'll come to yours.
Sure.
So, therefore, this distortion, where I believe it's a sacrilege to try and make a religion like Hinduism into a Wahhabi faith.
Hmm.
It's pure sacrilege.
Hmm.
It's against Hindus, Hinduism, and Hindu civilization. So that is the third distortion, or rather, that is the distortion that we need to guard out against
Hmm.
and need to fight, because if Hinduism says Ekam Satya Vipraha Bahuda Vadan,
Tanti.
the truth is one wise people call it by different names. If our ancient sages millennia ago had the courage to say at a time when the tribe was absolute, Ano Bhadraha Kritavo Yantu Vishwata, let good thoughts flow to me from all directions. If they had the audacity to say in nascent communities at the dawn of time, Udara Charitanam Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, for the big hearted, the entire world is your friend. These are the defining characteristics of a mature Hinduism driven by the conquering eclecticism which has made it Sanatan or eternal, and not these the narrow vision of these newfound semi-literate evangelists. So we have to guard against that. These people don't know, as I mentioned to you earlier, dharma, artha, kama, even the pursuit of the sensual or the physical in proportion and right and not in exclusion is part of the four great purusharths of Hinduism. And they go about imposing Victorian morality on young couples in parks and harassing them in the name of protecting Hinduism. How great can the level of ignorance be? So, in other words, so that is the third aspect. So these are three reasons why Hinduism, perhaps although it would, I believe, will remain a Sanatan faith, has become a weaker one. As far as your question on women is concerned, yes, there was a time when both are where women and caste are concerned. We did not have the same subordination or the same rigidity. You have in the Brihadaranika Upanishad,
Correct.
Gargi having a dialogue with Yagnavalkya in the public assembly called by King Janak of Videha, arguing with him on equal terms.
Right.
It's a very illustrative story. You had the feisty Draupadi who could ask in a public assembly, whom did Yudhishthir lose first, himself or me?
Hmm.
You had Maitri. The Arthashastra mentions women in very important and sensitive places high up in the administration.
True.
So there was probably a much greater respect for women, but sometime around the second century CE, sorry, there was uh, 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 the use of the uh, smritis by vested interests to legitimize the subordination of women, and I want to say about caste as well. All recent scientific evidence, including DNA evidence, makes clear that initially, for the first phases of Hindu civilization, there was a great deal of interaction and interface between the castes,
Intermingling. They were, yeah.
intermingling.
Intermingling, yeah.
But it became much worse. The rigidity, exploitation, oppression, and discrimination around the second century CE. So these are points that we need to bear.
Correct. Pavanji, I know you're short on time, so if we can just, I'll end my questions because otherwise I could keep you here for 3 hours. If we could ask one last audience question, please. I saw a few coming up. Uh, if the uh, okay, Mohit, Akansha, if I can ask to Pavanji. So Akansha had a question: why do the youth today have an inferiority about our own culture, their Hindu culture? And the next one, just these two, Pavanji, and then we'll end it. Mohit, people of my age, he's 20, think that spirituality is not for them. What can we do to bring more people into spirituality? Pavanji, if you could answer both of them.
No, I think the question of inferiority can be wiped clean, the slate, by knowledge. Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahm.
Hmm.
There is great power in knowledge. How can there be inferiority when you are aware of some of the great refinements of which you are a final legatee? There cannot be inferiority. But there can be if your understanding is superficial or your knowledge is limited. So, certainly that's one. As far as spirituality is concerned, I genuinely believe that you may not be interested in it as much at the age of 20 as you may be at 40 and perhaps more at 60. But there are great reservoirs of solace. It's a prompter to go below the surface, even in secular terms. And there are uh, great offtakes of spirituality in the secular areas of management and peace of mind. I mean, take the notion of Nishkam Karma
Correct.
of the Bhagavad Gita, of doing your duty without thought of reward. I think it is one of the great panaceas for the existential dilemmas of the modern world. Uh, it gives you recourse to a certain mental stability when there could be so much instability around.
Fascinating. It's utterly fascinating discussion, Ambassador Varma. We could, I'm sure, carry this on for many more hours, but one is aware of the limitations of time. Uh, Thank you so much for gracing the Nehru Center
It's
with
always good to be back home.
all of you. The book is available on Kindle form in the UK as well. Do check it out, The Great Hindu Civilization by Ambassador Varma. Fascinating read, one of the best books I have read in a long time.
Coming from
Pavanji,
you, I take it as a great compliment. Thank you, Amish.
Pavanji, thank you so much for gracing the stage with your presence. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, sir.